So good afternoon, everybody. I'm presenting this work. It's basically on social background, inequality in academic track enrollment. So this is a joint work with Emanuele Fedeli, both from the University of Trento, and is part of a larger project which is called Inequalities. Now, let me give you some background information. First of all, we know from plenty of studies that social background inequalities in final educational attainment are still very large in many developed countries. So even if there has been improvement over time, there has been still nowadays a strong role of social background, family background on the educational destinies of children. And many studies across Europe found that one crucial transition is the enrollment into the academic track versus other kind of track. So this is a major institutional, let's say, condition, institutional source of the intergenerational reproduction of social inequalities. We know that enrollment in the academic track is also associated with subsequent higher level of achievement in school, less dropout risks, higher university enrollments, and also higher occupational outcomes, also in our country. Now, one of the main questions related to this literature is basically why and how educational inequalities are reproduced across generations. In the social stratification literature in sociology, three main lines of research have been developed in the recent, let's say, 20 years. So first, there are studies that look at specific educational transitions within the educational path. Second, some studies look at how educational inequalities are, let's say, reproduced in different contexts. And this is a kind of cross-national literature for most part. And the last stream of the literature is looking at the possible mechanisms, the possible channels by which socioeconomic status basically can be reproduced through educational decisions. Now, I report this broad overview because with this work we ambitiously try to connect all these kinds of literature which are to some extent separated. More specifically, the research aims are three. So first of all, we would like to inspect and describe within country geographical differentiation in the relation between social background and academic track enrollment. So, does this relation vary across different contexts within the same country? This is a question that very few studies have addressed, mostly because of lack of data. The second is try to better understand the main channels by which these social background inequalities are reproduced, and we will distinguish between three channels that are called primary, secondary, and tertiary effects in the social stratification literature. And finally, we would like to explore the sources of geographic differences in the channels of reproduction of educational inequalities. What does it mean? It means that it could be that social inequalities could be similar or different across different regions, provinces within Italy. But it's not enough. It could be that the sources behind these inequalities could be different across different territories. This has been never explored so far, either in other countries. So why Italy? There are substantial reasons. So first of all, we know that Italy comparatively has a low educational attainment rate. There are kind of high levels of educational inequalities. We know also that there are many strong geographical divides, both in socioeconomic resources of families, but also in terms of school outcomes. And also we have this decision about school track in a critical phase, which has been shown to be very important and consequential for educational careers. And also, because now we have recently novel, large-scale population panel data allowing to provide a credible answer to these questions. You need a large data set because if you want to inspect the, let's say, territorial heterogeneity, and for addressing this issue about the transition, you need longitudinal data. So this is a nice combination of the data that we can rely on. So the theoretical framework is basically rooted in the work of Boudon and then expanded by Jetson and by Esser. So the main idea is that social background, social origin, which could mean, let's say, several things. Here we use a broader concept encompassing different parental resources, education, occupation, and so on, might positively affect the probability of enrolling in the academic track, which basically is the Lyceum in Italy. And then we can think about different kind of channels that might explain this advantage or expected advantage of high SES children. We don't separate between primary and secondary effects, with basically the idea that the primary effect is an indirect channel from social origin to school track, passing via, let's say, ability, academic ability. Okay, so higher, let's say, high SES children might have higher performance, higher academic competencies, and we know that students with higher academic competencies, all else being equal, are more likely to continue their studies in a more demanding academic track. More recently, there has been a new contribution by Esser, who suggested to, let's say, further expand this theoretical model by separating two kinds of, let's say, ability measures. On one side, let's say, something is measured in a more standardized way, more referred to academic competencies, and instead the signaling effect that could be placed could be in the hands of teachers. So teachers have power to providing, let's say, grades to students or even recommendation after the lower secondary education, which could be stratified by social origin and could also affect, of course, the behavior and the enrollment pattern of children from different families. And these are, you call them the tertiary effects. And then we have secondary effects, which is the residual, basically, in this, let's say, decomposition exercise that we will see. The secondary effects are, they are related to family decision. So these are related to family decision for children that have virtually the same academic competencies and receive by the teachers the same marks. We know that still, among these comparable individuals, families with different resources decide differently, and the transition rate to Lyceums are different. So just to summarize, the primary effects refer to the part of the socioeconomic background differences in educational transition that are due to the different students' academic abilities in our framework. Secondary effects to the part of inequalities that basically refer to, let's say, family decision with comparable students' competencies and grades. And tertiary effects to the role played by teachers in signaling, let's say, with grades, in this case only grades because we don't have track recommendation, that are not aligned with student competencies. Let me give you just maybe two caveats. So this framework is descriptive, so even if you find the word effects, these actually are not causal effects, so you might understand them as, let's say, components or of these inequalities. And second, we are not interested in isolating all the single factors contributing to social inequalities, because it's impossible, basically, but just to identify, let's say, the composite overall inequalities in these three channels. So, in terms of data and variables, we use INVALSI data, which provide information on student competencies, educational pathways across school grades, on the whole population of students. So we merge together multiple cohorts. Basically, we follow more than 1 million students coming from different academic years. And the most important thing is that we follow them from the 8th grade to the 10th grade. So 8th grade students are in the lower secondary education last year, and then we look at them in the 10th grade. So our outcome variable is track enrollment in the 10th grade. So this is, of course, not the decision, because we cannot observe the decision in the first year, but it's still quite relevant outcome because it's measured immediately afterwards, 1 year afterwards, and still it has consequences for later trajectories. Basically, we distinguish between classical and scientific lyceums versus all other schools. Why? Because we know from the literature that this is a kind of advantageous outcome compared to the others. Independent variable, we use a standardized index of economic socio-cultural status provided by INVALSI. We also tried alternative measures built by us, but basically the results are the same. We have, in terms of, let's say, mediators, a measure of student competencies, which is the average of standardized test scores in language and mathematics in the 8th grade, and also teacher's assessment, which is the average of lower secondary marks in the same subjects, plus some basic control variables, gender, child migration background, and the dummies for the academic cohorts. So in terms of methods, pretty basic. We use binomial logistic regression in the first instance to estimate the total effect, let's say, the total association between social background and academic track enrollment. In the second stage, we use the KHB methods, which is a decomposition method, which is useful when you use nonlinear regression models. And we basically decompose the total association between social background and academic track enrollment in 3 channels, pertaining to the primary, secondary, and tertiary components. Now, of course, this model has some restrictions, so we did some robustness checks. The first one is we use structural equation models in order to better correct for possible measurement error, and also for following a direct path from the academic performance to the grades, but the results are very similar, so we just stick to our main findings. We also use other additional approaches, but again, the results are pretty stable, so it's fine. We also did some checks. Instead of using the whole population data, we check with the sample, the random sample of schools where there is an external control. We cannot, of course, have such a fine-grained map that I will show you, but overall the finding seems in the same direction. Let's look at the results. So first of all, let's look at whether and how social inequalities by social background in track enrollment vary across the territories in Italy. So first of all, on the left, you find a general overview. Here we distinguish north, center, and south, and the dots that you see in the graph are the provinces. Okay? Here there is a triangle. You don't know whether you see, but the triangles are not so far, which means that actually if you look at this tripartite distinction, overall, let's say, the inequalities are pretty similar across the different macro areas. There is, of course, some different heterogeneity between the provinces within these macro areas, a little bit higher in the south and smaller in the center, as you see. Now let's look more, let's say, closely with a geographical map of these inequalities. So this is a corporate map where you find a darker color. It means there is a stronger association between social background and academic track enrollment. The reverse is true if you find a lighter color. And what you see is basically, at least from this analysis, is that in general you find 2 main areas that are, let's say, more colored, which are in the north and in the south, and also in Sicily, and lighter in the center. So this is our first result. So inequalities in academic track enrollment are smaller in the center of Italy and in Sardinia as well. But if you look at the scale, actually the heterogeneity is present, but it's not so pronounced, because we are going from, let's say, 9 percentage points to more or less 70. Okay, so it's not so huge. This is the first result. Second, we check about what is the most important component for explaining social background inequalities in academic track enrollment. Primary, so students' ability or competencies, secondary, family decision, or teacher's assessment. And the result, in general, is in line with some other findings. You find that secondary effects are the dominant channel. They are followed by tertiary effects, and finally primary effects. And you see also the distribution, and also this is the distribution across provinces, which means that there is more variation in the role of teacher's assessment and in the family decision across provinces than in the role of competencies. Now, let's look at, it takes some time because it's okay. So this is the distribution over provinces of the primary, secondary, and tertiary effects, measured in terms of the relative contribution. So the percentage of the total inequality that is explained statistically by these three components. And what you find, basically, some interesting finding is that tertiary effects, so teachers' assessments, seems to be more important in the southern region, secondary effects in the northeast of Italy, and primary effects a little bit in Sardinia and in the north central, let's say, areas. But again, here the differentiation is not so huge because the primary effects account for a tiny, let's say, proportion of inequalities. Now, just quickly, given that, so the primary and the tertiary effects are due to two things. So the tertiary effects are due to a path that goes from social origin to teacher's marks, and let's say the effect of teacher marks on enrollment in the lyceum. We want to understand whether one of the two paths is more, let's say, contributing more to the final findings that we show. So this is new compared to this. And so what we did here is to normalize these two paths, and here you have a diagonal. What does it mean? So if you find a province above the diagonal, it means that the path that we call D is more important, and if you find instead a province that is below the diagonal, it means that the C path is more important. And here you find divided by north, central, and south, that actually it really depends on the area, because in the north you find that the relationship between marks and academic track enrollment is more important consistently across the provinces, while in the south you see a little bit a reverse pattern, and it seems that the, let's say, attribution of marks that is related to social background of children net of their competencies to measuring the test is also important in many provinces. So both aspects matter. If you look at primary effects, it's different. So in terms of primary effects, you see that basically all provinces, or most of them, are below the diagonal, which means that actually what drives the small amount of explanation brought by the primary effects is basically this path A. So the relationship between social origin and test score, and not much the relationship between test score and social background inequality. Now, last finding, it's just about macro correlation. So we want to investigate, this is something that we are going to develop, so it's just very preliminary, whether these sources of inequalities are related to some macro level characteristics of the territories. We relate the primary effects with the measure of income inequality, the Gini index at the province level, and then the tertiary effects with a measure that is built by us, that it approximates the school added value. And basically, if you look at the total, at least let's see here, we find that there is a negative relationship between the Gini index and the primary effects. So in the provinces with higher inequalities, ability matters less. While in the context in which the schools are, let's say, of higher quality or they provide added value, the role of the teacher assessment increases. Now, this is very preliminary. Conclusions, take-home messages. So, average SES-based inequality in academic track enrollment are to some extent similar across geographical areas. They vary to some extent across provinces within these macro areas, but not so much. Family decisions, irrespective of student competencies and teachers' evaluations, are the prevalent source of reproduction of inequalities in educational transition in Italy, especially the transition to academic track. There is more geographical heterogeneity in the channels by which educational inequalities are reproduced than in the total inequality related to social background. And selection on ability or competencies, so the primary component, is weaker in higher economic unequal provinces. So the conclusion, with this work we try to move beyond the so-called methodological nationalism by showing that not only the total inequalities in relation to social background vary within countries, but also the explanation or the channels behind these inequalities might have different importance, relative importance in different contexts. And the implications for the literature are that some of the traditional arguments that refer to educational institution features such as tracking, standardization, which are characteristics of the nation educational system, cannot explain these variations since they are constant within Italy. So we have to look for additional, let's say, contextual explanation that they do not refer to formal educational characteristics of the educational system. I think I finished. Thank you very much.